I've never been one to believe in the supernatural, but that night at the motel, I can't explain what happened. It started when I was on a long drive, trying to make my way across the state. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself in the middle of nowhere, with no other option but to check into the first place I could find. It was a place that looked straight out of the 70s, old, faded sign flickering in the wind, a few cars scattered in the parking lot. The kind of place you'd usually keep driving past, but I was exhausted. It had been hours since I'd seen another soul on the road, so I decided to pull in. The clerk behind the counter was an older man, his face lined with years of service. He gave me a long, assessing look when I walked in. His eyes, I noticed, were too sharp, too calculating, like he'd been waiting for someone like me. "Room 13, he said, without asking for my ID or credit card. The key was old-fashioned, with a tarnished metal tag that read 13 in bold, unsettling letters. I took the key and thanked him, but he didn't reply. He just stared as I walked out, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room itself wasn't much better. The wallpaper was peeling, the bed was unmade, and the air smelled damp and stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. But I was too tired to care. I locked the door behind me, dropped my bag onto the bed, and pulled the covers up. That's when I heard it. A tapping, soft at first, like fingers drumming on the window. I froze. My first thought was that it was the wind, maybe a branch hitting the glass. But as the tapping grew louder, more insistent, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't natural. I got up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and approached the window. As I peered out, I could see nothing. Just the empty parking lot. But the tapping continued. That's when I noticed something even more unsettling: there were no other cars. Not a single soul in sight. The tapping stopped abruptly. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't even call anyone for reassurance. There was nothing I could do but sit back down on the bed and try to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep that night. Every little noise made me jump. The silence in the room felt suffocating, oppressive, like something was watching, waiting. By morning, I was ready to leave. I packed up quickly, not wanting to spend another minute in that room. But when I went to the front desk to check out, the old clerk just nodded at me like he'd been expecting me. "Room 13, he said, his voice cold, as if he'd heard this story 1,000 times before. That night, I found out why. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with that place. When I left the motel, I thought I'd put it behind me, but the unsettling vibe lingered. I continued my drive, the hum of the road filling the silence, but no matter how much I tried to focus on the miles ahead, my mind kept drifting back to that room. Something felt unfinished. A few hours later, I found myself on a quiet stretch of highway again. The sun was low, just about to set, when I saw it, another motel, identical to the last one. The same 70s neon sign, the same faded charm. I had no intention of stopping, but the pull was there. I hadn't seen a single car on the road in the last half hour, and with the sun setting quickly, I felt that gnawing sense of unease creeping back. It wasn't until I saw the figure standing near the office that I knew I was going to stop. It was a woman. Tall, with dark hair, wearing a long coat despite the warm weather. She didn't look like she belonged at a place like this. She seemed out of place in every way, like she was just waiting for someone, and I was the one she'd been waiting for. Against my better judgment, I parked and walked up to the office. The man behind the counter greeted me with a tight smile. His eyes looked strangely familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen him before. "Room 13 is available again," he said, handing me a key without a word more. "Wait," I started to say, my mind reeling. "You don't have any other rooms?" He simply shook his head. "Only room 13. Confusion gnawed at me, but I grabbed the key anyway. It was like the place was drawing me in, and every warning in my mind seemed distant, irrelevant. I walked to the same room, the one that I'd left hours ago. Room 13. This time, I hesitated at the door. Something felt wrong, like the air was too still, too heavy. I unlocked it and pushed the door open, but what I saw inside was enough to freeze my blood. The room hadn't changed in the slightest, same peeling wallpaper, same broken bed, but this time there was a figure standing in the corner. A tall shadow, unmoving. My first instinct was to turn and run, but before I could move, the figure spoke. "Did you come back for me?" It was a woman's voice, calm, almost soothing, but the words struck a deep, primal fear in me. It was as if she knew exactly who I was, what I had done. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't understand. Who are you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, and the closer she got, the more I realized that she didn't look entirely human. Her skin was pale, too pale, stretched too tightly over her bones. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, empty. She was wrong. And then I saw it, the key around her neck, the same tarnished metal tag that read Room 13. I turned, my feet moving faster than my brain could process. I had to get out of there. I ran out the door, but as I crossed the threshold, the world around me seemed to warp. The motel parking lot had changed, there were no cars, no lights. It was just a barren wasteland stretching out before me. I looked back. The woman was gone, but I could feel her presence lingering in the air, as though she was still watching, still waiting. I knew I had to leave. I ran to my car, the key shaking in my hand as I tried to start the engine. For a moment, it seemed like I was trapped, like the car wouldn't start, like the world was closing in around me. Then, with a sputter, the engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I sped away from the motel. But even as I drove, the unsettling feeling didn't fade. I felt like something was following me. Something from that place. Something that wasn't human. I survived that night. But I'm still haunted by what happened in that motel. What I saw. What I felt. And I know that it's not over. I tried to push it all to the back of my mind. I convinced myself it was just a bad experience, a coincidence, that the woman in room 13 wasn't real. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was the isolation of being on the road for so long. But something kept clawing at the edge of my mind, like I'd left a piece of myself behind at that motel. The drive the next day was uneventful, miles and miles of empty road. But every time I passed an old motel, every time I saw a flicker of a neon sign, my stomach would tighten. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled toward something. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something darker, deeper. It felt as though I was being called. It wasn't until the third night that I stopped again. I don't know what made me do it. The pull was too strong. Maybe it was a part of me that wanted answers. Maybe it was a part of me that couldn't resist the mystery, or maybe it was the feeling that something had already marked me, and I was going to end up back there whether I liked it or not. I turned off the highway, my tires crunching on the gravel as I approached the motel. And there it was again, like it had been waiting for me, faded neon, the same old sign flickering in the wind. But this time, something was different. The air was thick, oppressive, like a storm was coming. I didn't see the woman or the clerk, but I knew that I wasn't alone. I hesitated for a moment. There was no one around, no sign of life. The parking lot was empty. I walked up to the office door, and this time, the clerk was sitting behind the counter, his eyes empty and distant, like he hadn't moved in years. "Room 13, he said without looking up, his voice low and raspy. "It's waiting for you." I nodded, even though I didn't want to. He didn't give me the key this time. Instead, he handed me something else, an old photograph. The black and white image was blurry, but I could make out the faint outlines of the same motel, and standing in front of it, was a woman. But not the woman I had seen before. This woman was different, older, with the same hollow eyes, but her face was twisted in an unnatural smile. Her expression didn't match the situation, it was wrong. I asked him who she was, but he didn't answer. He didn't even look up from his desk. I walked to room 13, and as I unlocked the door, the air inside seemed to grow colder. The room was dark, despite the dim light overhead. The bed was made, too perfectly so. Everything was still. But then I saw it, a shadow in the corner. It was the woman again, but this time, she wasn't standing. She was sitting in the chair by the window, her head turned toward me, her eyes wide, unblinking. She was smiling. I froze. The photograph flashed in my mind, the twisted smile, the hollow eyes. The same woman. "You came back," she said, her voice soft, almost sweet, like she was welcoming me. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in that room with her, with whatever this thing was. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked, standing up slowly. Her movements were jerky, like her joints weren't meant to bend that way. I didn't answer. "You're one of us now," she whispered, and that's when I realized, she wasn't just a woman. She wasn't even human. She was something else. Something old, something that had been waiting for me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached the door, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I was yanked back into the room. "You can't leave," she hissed, her voice now warped, inhuman. "You're already part of us." I struggled, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was moving through molasses. The more I fought, the more I realized, I was trapped. Trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. But then, just as I thought it was over, I heard a loud crash. The door burst open, and in the doorway stood a figure, someone I didn't recognize. A man, tall and broad, with dark hair. He didn't say anything. He just walked in, grabbed the woman by the arm, and yanked her away from me. "You need to go," he said, his voice calm, as if he had been here before. "Now." I didn't hesitate. I ran. I bolted out the door and into the parking lot, my legs shaking, my mind racing. I don't know who that man was, or what he had to do with the woman. But he saved me that night. And when I looked back, the motel was gone. The parking lot, the sign, the entire building, they had vanished. I drove for hours after that, not stopping, not even slowing down until the sun began to rise. I never looked back, but I know one thing for certain, there's something in that motel. Something ancient, something hungry. And it's still waiting for its next guest. I thought I was free. I thought that once I left the motel behind, once I escaped, I could leave the nightmare in the rearview mirror. But I was wrong. It's never that simple. In the days that followed, I tried to go back to normal life. I got back to my routine, to my work, to everything I thought was real. But something wasn't right. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, the woman in the room. Her hollow eyes, her twisted smile, that feeling of being watched. I couldn't escape it. It wasn't long before the dream started. At first, they were just flashes, quick images that didn't make sense. But the more I tried to ignore them, the clearer they became. The motel, the woman, the dark figure in the doorway. Every night, they came closer. Every night, they got more vivid. And every time I woke up, drenched in sweat, the feeling of her presence lingered. But that's not the worst part. I began noticing things. Small things at first. Shadows in the corners of my vision, a flicker in the reflection of mirrors. It didn't seem like much, but it gnawed at me. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, who could blame me? I had survived something no one should have to experience. But the truth was, something had followed me. Something from that place. A few weeks later, I went to a doctor. I needed to talk to someone, to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. But the doctor just nodded, wrote me a prescription for sleep, and told me it would pass with time. He didn't understand. No one did. One night, I decided to drive again. I thought if I just hit the road, I could outrun it. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to leave. I drove for hours, aimlessly, just trying to escape the constant terror. It was late when I found myself on a stretch of highway I didn't recognize. No signs, no lights, just darkness. And then I saw it. A motel. It looked almost exactly like the one I had stayed at. Same faded sign, same lonely parking lot, and for a moment, I thought I had somehow driven back to that cursed place. My heart raced, my hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. But something was off. There was no room 13. I walked into the office anyway, my legs heavy, and the moment the door swung open, I felt it, coldness, darkness, like something was watching me. The man behind the counter was different this time. Young, scruffy, with a wild look in his eyes. He didn't greet me. He just stared at me, his gaze piercing, almost knowing. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I froze. The air felt thick, suffocating. "What do you mean?" He smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was cold. Empty. "You're already too late. You should have left. The motel, it follows. It never lets go." I backed away, but it was already too late. I turned and ran back to my car, but as I reached the parking lot, I heard the tapping again, the same soft, rhythmic tapping on my window. I couldn't look. I didn't want to look. But I did. And there she was. The woman. Her face, pale and twisted, pressed against the glass. Her mouth opened, and I could hear her voice, low, croaky, like a whisper from the depths of hell. "You can't escape. You're ours now." I slammed my foot on the gas, the car speeding out of the parking lot, tires screeching. But as I drove, I realized with horror that the world outside was changing. The road was stretching on forever. The same dark sky, the same empty stretch of highway. The motel was following me. I didn't know how. I didn't know why. But I knew one thing for sure, it wasn't over. It would never be over. And I was never going to escape. It had been months since that night. Since I fled the motel for the second time, I thought I had finally managed to escape its grip. I stopped driving for long stretches of highway. I stayed in well-lit, well-populated cities where there was noise and life, and the shadows didn't seem so hungry. But no matter what I did, the feeling of being followed didn't go away. It gnawed at me every day, in the back of my mind. The nightmares, the whispers. I could never forget her face. And then came the phone call. I was sitting at home, just about to go to bed, when my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I hesitated. It could be a scam, or a wrong number. But for some reason, I picked up. "Hello." The voice on the other end was raspy, like it had been dragged through years of dust and decay. "It's time," the voice said. "You know what you did." I felt a chill run down my spine. My mouth went dry, and my heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But the voice didn't answer. Instead, I heard a faint tapping in the background, like fingers drumming on something hard. Tap. 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 I slammed the phone down, my hands trembling. I didn't know who that was, but I knew one thing for sure, it was them. The motel. It was reaching out, calling me back, telling me that I couldn't escape. I had to go back. I didn't have a choice. Days passed, and I tried to ignore the growing compulsion. The urge to return. I tried to tell myself that I was being paranoid, that the phone call didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It was never over. The next morning, I drove. I don't know why. I don't know what made me think it was a good idea to get back on that road, but there I was, the engine of my car humming as I sped down a long, deserted highway. Hours passed. I don't even know where I was going, or if I was even in the same state anymore. And then, as the sun began to set, I saw it again. That motel. The same faded sign. The same empty parking lot. But this time, it wasn't empty. There were cars parked out front, too many cars. Too many people. I pulled into a space without thinking. It was like my body knew what I had to do, and I couldn't stop it. My heart raced in my chest as I got out of the car, my feet heavy as I walked toward the office. When I stepped inside, I wasn't surprised to see the man behind the counter. He looked the same as before, older, maybe, but his eyes still held that same knowing, calculating gaze. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, like he was waiting. "You've come back," he said finally, his voice empty. "You can't leave now." I felt a coldness spread through me, like ice creeping into my bones. My throat tightened, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. And then I saw them. The people. They were sitting in the corner of the room, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes staring blankly ahead. They were just like the woman in the room, like her twisted, empty face. They didn't move. They didn't blink. But I knew, they were waiting. I turned to run, but before I could make it to the door, a voice stopped me. "You can't leave," she said. It was her. The woman. She was standing in the doorway. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, there were others, people I had never seen before, but their faces were familiar, in a way that made my blood run cold. They were all wearing the same blank expression. "You're one of us now," she whispered. "You belong here." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, like something was holding me there, tethering me to that cursed building. I could feel her cold hand on my shoulder, her breath on my neck. And then the room filled with the sound of tapping. Tap. 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 It was everywhere. It was all around me. The tapping, the scratching, the whispering, all blending into one terrible sound that reverberated inside my skull. "You'll never escape," she whispered again, her voice now an eerie chorus that echoed in my mind. But then, just as quickly as it had all started, everything went silent. I opened my eyes. The room was empty. The people, the woman, the tapping, they were gone. I looked around. I was standing in the same motel room, alone. The walls were peeling, the air stale, just like before. The bed was made. Everything was still. But I knew. I knew I wasn't alone. I was never alone. I walked to the window, heart pounding, and when I looked outside, I saw it. The cars. The people. They were outside, watching me. Waiting. And I realized then, with a sickening clarity, that there was no escape. I was part of the motel now. Part of its never-ending cycle. And when the next person checks in, they'll be greeted by someone who knows exactly what it feels like to be trapped in that place. I don't know how long it's been. Time feels warped here, like it doesn't matter anymore. Days bleed into nights, nights into days, and the line between the two is gone. The woman, the others, they're always around me now. Watching. Waiting. Always waiting for the next guest, the next soul to be caught in the web of the motel. I tried to leave again. God knows I tried. I've walked through the same door countless times, hoping, praying, that this time, I would make it out. But every time, the world outside shifts, morphs, and warps. It's like the road stretches endlessly, leading me back to the motel no matter where I go, no matter how far I drive. I've learned that there is no running. No escaping. I don't remember how I got here today. One moment I was driving, the next, I was standing at the door, staring at the faded, flickering sign once more. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, I heard a voice behind me. Soft, like it was calling from a long distance. You came back, it whispered. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I knew who it was. It was her, the woman, the one with the hollow eyes, the twisted smile. She's always there now, always watching, always just beyond the corner of my eye, even when I close my eyes at night. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't scared. I had come to terms with it. There was no point in fighting anymore. I opened the door. The familiar smell of decay and dust hit me instantly. The room was just as I remembered, empty, still, and cold. The walls seemed to press in, and I could feel the weight of the silence. But this time, there was something more. I could feel it in my bones, like a presence, something heavier than air, more oppressive than before. I stepped inside. The woman was already there, sitting in the same chair by the window. But she didn't look at me. She was staring out into the darkness, her face still pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. You finally accepted it, she said, her voice distant, detached, like she was speaking to herself. You know what you are now. You're part of the motel. You can't leave. You'll never leave. I stood there, frozen, not knowing what to say, not knowing how to feel. I had spent so long trying to understand what had happened, trying to make sense of it, but now, it didn't matter anymore. The tapping started. It was soft at first, a faint rhythm coming from somewhere behind me. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder. Tap. 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 I turned slowly, and that's when I saw them. The people. The same hollow-eyed souls that had been trapped here. They were standing in the corners of the room, in the shadows, their faces blank, their eyes trained on me. I knew they were waiting for me to join them, to take my place in the endless cycle. I could hear their whispers, faint at first, but growing clearer. It's your turn now. You belong to the motel. Welcome home. I wanted to scream, to fight, to tear myself away from this nightmare. But as I looked at their faces, lifeless, emotionless, I realized the truth. It had been my turn all along. I had always been meant to be here. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in. I reached for the door, desperate to escape, but as my hand touched the doorknob, it vanished. The door was gone. There was no way out. I was trapped. Trapped in this endless loop. Suddenly, the clerk appeared, standing behind the desk, his eyes locked on mine. His smile was wide and knowing, like he'd been waiting for me to understand. You should have known, he said softly. You never really left. You can't escape what's already inside you. I felt a coldness spread through me, starting from my chest and crawling outward. I could feel the power of the motel sinking its claws into my soul, pulling me deeper into its web. There was no escape now. I was just another part of its never-ending nightmare. The woman stood and walked toward me. She was close now, too close. Her cold hand brushed against my skin, and I felt the chill spread through my entire body. You'll be here forever, she whispered, her voice a soft, eerie lullaby. And when the next guest comes, you'll be the one to greet them. You'll be the one to welcome them to their new home. I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, like it wasn't mine anymore. I was a part of the motel. And the motel was a part of me. And as I stood there, frozen, I knew that no matter how many people came through those doors, no matter how many souls were swallowed by this place, it would always be waiting for me. For us. We were all part of the motel now. And we would never leave. I don't remember when it happened. 1 minute, I was standing in that room, the woman's cold touch on my skin, the voices echoing in my ears. The next, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I was somewhere else. The world around me was shifting, distorting, like I was in the space between worlds. I felt weightless, suspended in an endless void, and then, just as suddenly, it was gone. I was back. Back in the motel. But this time, something was different. The air was suffocating, thick with an oppressive energy that weighed down on me like 1,000 pounds. The silence wasn't just silence, it was alive. It was hungry. And I could feel it crawling under my skin, wrapping around my mind. I was no longer the same person I had been before. Something had changed inside me. A shift. I had crossed a line that I could never come back from. I looked around the room, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw it clearly. The faded wallpaper. The peeling paint. The smell of decay. It wasn't just a place. It was alive. And it wasn't just the walls that watched me now, it was everything. The very foundation of this motel, the dark energy that pulsed beneath it, was aware of me. It had always been aware. I was no longer a guest. I was a part of it. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, my mind racing. The woman appeared again, but this time, there was no more fear in her eyes. She was smiling, but it wasn't the same twisted grin I had seen before. This was different, calm, serene, knowing. "You finally understood," she said, her voice soothing. "You've always been one of us. And now, you will be the one to bring the next guest in." I didn't fight it. I didn't scream. I didn't run. It was pointless. There was nothing left to fight. I had become a part of the motel, a part of its cycle. I would never leave. I couldn't. I felt the door open behind me, and I turned to see the clerk standing there. He didn't speak this time. He didn't need to. He just nodded, as if acknowledging the inevitable. He was part of it too. A cog in the machinery that never stopped turning. I walked toward the door, my feet moving without thought. I didn't know where I was going, or who the next guest would be. I only knew that I would greet them. I would show them the room. I would offer them the key. And I would wait, just like I had waited for so long. The door opened into the same dark hallway, the same empty parking lot. The same never-ending road. But now, I knew my role. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't even a prisoner anymore. I was part of the motel. And the motel would never stop.